Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the TAPED podcast, the best podcast in the world. I am your host, Nostalgia, and joined, as always, by my co-host,
MickyT.
And today, as you may have noticed, if you looked at the title,
If you
it's a very special episode. It is the 100th episode of the TAPED podcast.
Woo! Oh my god.
Yeah, honestly, it's crazy that we've gotten this far. Time's low-key flown. It does not feel like we've done 100 of these, but...
Nah, honestly.
Yeah,
how long has it been?
At this
3
point,
years, 2 years?
Yeah, closing in on 3 years in December.
Man, that's actually fucking crazy. I can't believe that.
Yeah.
And...
So yeah, to commemorate the occasion, we wanted to recreate our very first episode, excluding the pilot, which was just kind of us testing out everything. And that was a Radiohead worst to best.
Yes,
obviously a very, very big episode. That was not really done justice by our amateur way of doing these podcasts back in December of 2019. Yeah, it's not aged the best. We've gotten better at what we do.
Yeah, to say that one has kind of aged like milk would be an understatement. It's genuinely hard to sit through. So we decided that we wanted to do this episode again. We wanted to do the Redux worst to best. And just basically recreate the first ever episode we did, but with better quality, you know? With the professional podcasting minds that we have now, pretty much.
Professional, yes.
Professional is one way to put it.
Yeah, and one thing I'm curious about is if your list has changed in the last 3 years at all.
Yeah, same. I think a few scores have changed, all right, but I'm excited to see where our lists go. How we think now, 3 years later.
Yeah.
And do you have anything else to add?
No, just let's get right into it.
Okay then, we're gonna just do every single Radiohead album now, starting from Pablo Honey all the way up to A Moon-Shaped Pool. No side projects, comps, live albums, all that kind of shit. So, with that in mind, our number 9 picks, I chose Pablo Honey.
At number 9, I chose The King of Limbs. So no movement for me.
No movement for me either. I really debated putting The King of Limbs last, but I don't know. The infamous Pablo Honey. By far the most popular choice for Radiohead's worst album, if you were to ask someone. The album that Radiohead themselves aren't too fond of either, and the album that pretty much kickstarted Radiohead's career because of the massive success of Creep, which is still their most popular song. But, despite Pablo Honey's shortcomings and, despite it being dead last on my list, I don't think Pablo Honey is as bad as some people make it out to be. And if we're being honest, it wouldn't really have been shat on as much if not for the band's disapproval of it, or Tom's disapproval of Creep, or if any other band that wasn't fucking Radiohead made it. Pablo Honey itself, outside of the context of what Radiohead did after it, is a perfectly acceptable, albeit generic, 90s alternative rock album. It isn't as bad as some Radiohead fans make it out to be, and there's actually a handful of really great alt-rock material on here outside of the big hit Creep. It does blend with a lot of 90s alt-rock tropes in the grander scheme of things. It features some tones and dynamics that are heavily influenced by grunge, as well as some Britpop influences. The guitar tone isn't amazing or anything, but there's a good amount of solid instrumentals on here, and generally the band do a decent job. At this point, they're basically trying to find their footing as a band, and it's forgivable to me when some of the songs turn out as great as they are on this thing. Tom York vocally isn't quite the great vocalist that he would become, and while he does have some sloppy moments, he does do a pretty good job on a lot of tracks here. The hooks are there, the talent is there, it's just not fully realised yet. There are some cringe lyrics that are tropey as well, but they aren't painstakingly shit, I will say. There's definitely a lot of underwhelming tracks in this thing, particularly towards the back half, which is a slog admittedly, but given that there's plenty of great and decent songs, I think it's fine. It may be a bit inconsistent, but at least it's not downright terrible from front to back like some people seem to think. Some people being Louis. It's just pretty decent, albeit forgettable. Outside of that, I don't got a whole lot else to say about Pablo Honey. It isn't bad or awful or It's just decent. It's a bit dated 90s alt rock, but it just happens to be Radiohead's debut. There's a few great tracks on it, but I think it is fairly inconsistent, and knowing what the band would do thereafter kind of renders it a bit insignificant, in my opinion.
Yeah, I agree in that I don't think the last album, well, the bottom album on my rankings is bad, because The King of Limbs is a perfectly serviceable album. And honestly, there's something to be said about how interesting and unique the album's direction and compositions are, even in, a discography as groundbreaking as Radiohead's. But unfortunately, I think the final product, while often intriguing for the aforementioned reasons, just never really managed to resonate with me. To me, there's just something so soulless about The King of Limbs. The sound of this album was achieved by the band initially recording small instrumental sections and then sampling them to create loops over which the band would then, layer further instrumentation. A process that is definitely a new step in the band's progression. Something which is always welcome and appreciated with a band as especially as well traveled as Radiohead. And yeah, this makes for some kind of unique tracks in their discography, often like dipping its toes into like straight up IDM song structures. But there's just something about the repetitive, synthetic, and glitchy nature of this album that just kind of backfires and makes it feel just lifeless at times. Of course, it's got fantastic moments throughout where the aforementioned aspects are used to craft just very complete and memorable songs. But unfortunately, a lot of the material on here is far from the most memorable in Radiohead's career. And Radiohead's biggest mistake, at least on his studio album, is Feral. That track is just so fucking garbage. It's unbelievable. But yeah, at times this album just feels like a studio experiment that wasn't fully realized or wasn't really crafted with any real passion or belief in its own quality. The inconsistency combined with the album's short length just really makes it one that I rarely have the urge to revisit. And, while it does showcase an interesting instrumental direction, and, it just doesn't really shine much in the grand scheme of things. It just feels a little lifeless, and it just feels a little half-baked at times.
Okay, now with that in mind, my favorite tracks on Pablo Honey are You, Creep, and Blowout. My least favorite track is I Can't.
Oh, fuck you. My favorite tracks on King of Limbs are Lotus Flower and Separator. My least favorite tracks are Feral and Give Up the Ghost.
Oh, come on, man. That one's underrated.
Well, Feral.
No, not Feral. Fucking Give Up the Ghost.
It doesn't do anything for me.
Die.
Hey,
no, I don't mean
now.
that. I don't mean that. Wait, say that again?
We're even.
Okay, fine.
I Can't slander.
I Can't. It sucks, though.
I can't.
Alright, so we're moving on to our number 8 picks. I chose The King of Limbs.
I chose Pablo Honey. No movement.
No fucking movement whatsoever. The King of Limbs. Not exactly a high point in the band's discography. I think sonically it's a pretty unique spin on Radiohead's sound, but for an entire album, it doesn't really manage to pan out into something that feels totally memorable, with the exception of a few moments. Plus, some of Radiohead's worst material appears in this album too. Some of their most soulless and some of their most just plain boring material. But with that in mind, I don't think it's a bad album. I just think it's very flawed, and I don't think Radiohead managed to achieve what I think they were looking to achieve with it. To start with the positives, I appreciate The King of Limbs for being one of Radiohead's more experimental albums. Its recording process, and it's not one of those albums where it kind of like fits conventionally within like Radiohead's traditional sounds, I guess. It's not one of the first times that Radiohead decided to try blend electronic music and rock, but it's their kind of oddest twist on it, with lots of obscure time signatures and rhythms combined with just really moody glitchiness, IDM kind of structures, and just strange electronic elements. On paper, Radiohead should be knocking this kind of sound out of the park, but they don't really manage to do that consistently on The King of Limbs. I think there's a handful of great tracks in this album that are actually very replayable and thoroughly enjoyable, but it's hard to sit through the entire album when a lot of it is way too dull and or way too indulgent for my liking. Like, often it just feels like the band were trying way too hard with some of the more chaotic and weirder time signatures, and there are moments like Feral that just don't sound coherent at all. For sure, the great tracks on The King of Limbs are great, and honestly, since I really listened to it, and I've already said it before, I think Give Up the Ghost is probably one of the most underrated Radiohead tracks, but it's hard to rank it any higher knowing that the lackluster material that plagues this album is here. Plus, I rank it above Pablo Honey mainly because I find it to be sonically just a bit more of a unique and interesting listen. So, yeah, that King of Limbs. It's okay. It's not bad. It's not great. It's just okay. It misses the mark in a lot of cases, but the highs are worth listening to.
My number 7 pick was Pablo Honey. This album may oftentimes be seen as kind of the laughing stock of Radiohead's discography. Most people see this as just an awkward pastiche of 90s alt rock and a far cry from what the band would go on to become. And while, I do kind of agree with those points, I don't, this album really isn't indicative of anything else they would have released since. But I do still think that writing this album off entirely is just a little unfair. And I think it's just kind of fueled by the bias that a lot of people have towards Radiohead and the high expectations that they have of the band.
True.
I think, while Pablo Honey certainly has its weaker moments, how do you? I'm fucking looking right at you. Most of this album ranges from okay at worst to incredible at best. Creep is the obvious standout track here, and despite its popularity in the mainstream and the band's reservations towards the track, it didn't go on to become one of the most iconic tracks of the 90s for no reason. It's a timeless anthem. It's absolutely beautifully performed. I think Tom York's vocals on this track in particular definitely stood the test of time. But that track is far from the only instance of the Britpop and grunge-inspired alt-rock sound that Radiohead go for here working out well. Blowout is just such a good track. It's so damn smooth. Personally, I think I Can't is one of the most underrated tracks in their discography. It's just such a heartfelt and... Stop. It's such a heartfelt and just blissful moment in the album. And so, while the Radiohead we get on Pablo Honey is primitive, to put it one way, I still think any hate this album gets is mostly coming from people trying to compare it to the band's finest material. And, the band's finest material is quite frankly in a league of its own. So that comparison is just a little meaningless in my opinion. I enjoy this album for what it is. It's an okay debut album. And I do think the amount of just fantastic tracks on here make it a more than respectable album. But ultimately I would have to be very, very, very bold or just straight up lying to everyone if I was to pretend that this is any higher up the list. I do enjoy a lot of Pablo Honey.
Alright, and with that in mind, my favourite tracks on The King of Limbs are Bloom, Lotus Flower, and Give Up the Ghost. Worst track is Feral by a country mile.
My favourite tracks on Pablo Honey are Creep, I Can't, and Blowout. My least favourite track is How Do You?
Alright, so we're moving on to our number 7 picks. I chose Amnesiac.
I agree, Mick, and I must
Woo!
say there's movement because the album I had at number 7 3 years ago has jumped up a little bit. So there is movement.
I don't think there's any movement for me yet, if I remember correctly. And, so I'm sure everyone knows the deal with Amnesiac. The material from this album was recorded during the Kid A sessions and eventually came out as its own album a year after. And, despite it being seen by a lot of people as Kid A B-sides, it's actually a much different sounding and feeling album when compared to Kid A. Amnesiac feels more out there and all over the place stylistically in comparison, and while I think it's a bit inconsistent, I still think it's a very good album. It's a different experience to Kid A altogether, with lots of its ideas coming from all over the place. There's a lot of tracks that have the same kind of electronic feel as Kid A. There's some more art rock centered things. There's some piano based tracks, and there's even a jazz rock tune at the end with the incredible Life in a Glass House. It's not really cohesive, but it does house some of Radiohead's most essential songs from this era, And I do really appreciate Amnesiac for having its own vibe and for having its own feeling that it feels a bit more abstract even than Kid A. But I guess given that it has those Radiohead tracks, they are fucking fantastic, you know? Oh, hold on, I said that wrong. Plus, given its Radiohead, those great tracks are fucking fantastic as expected. With that being said, though, I do want to go back to what I said about the album being inconsistent. A lot of it kind of flip-flops in quality for me, with one track being amazing and another track being a bit underwhelming and so on. Like, some of the ideas are really repetitive and don't really feel all that fleshed out. They just kind of exist and don't really do nothing for me. They just kind of feel like these unfinished tracks that were kind of being looped together. Fucking Hunting Bears, I'm Looking at You. I feel like Amnesiac gets a pass for being a bit inconsistent because it's Radiohead, but at least the great moments are around, and there are plenty of great moments on Amnesiac. So yeah, I do like and enjoy Amnesiac, but I won't bullshit you and say that it's isn't inconsistent or at least has some mediocre tracks, because it does, which is why I can't really put it any higher. And yeah, that's what I gotta say.
Yeah, Amnesiac initially was 6th. It's moved down to 7th. And I must say, I fucking love this album. It's all smooth sailing from here on out. Everything here is an 8 above. But yeah, with 2000's Kid A, Radiohead dove deep into an electronic and somewhat jazzy direction. But, that's an album I'll talk about in detail later on. Amnesiac, however, is kind of the younger sibling to Kid A. I could call it an album of Kid A rejects, but while unfortunately somewhat accurate, it also wouldn't really do the album justice. I think Amnesiac is just really quite, a great entity in of itself. It's got some absolutely incredible tracks, and the fact that all of these tracks came from the Kid A sessions means this album is far more fluid and smooth flowing and cohesive than any B-sides project could ever hope to be. All of these tracks are from the same one session, and all of these tracks were kind of made with Radiohead in that same kind of electronica-inspired, similar mindset. So the project doesn't really feel like a compilation at any point. It does feel like an album, as it should. And I do think that this is a interesting release in the band's discography, and I think everything from here on out is essential listening, and this is no exception for me. I think the experiments that Radiohead attempt on this project are some of the most boldest and just unusual in their entire discography. I think maybe the pressures of these tracks not really making them, making their way onto Kid A kind of allowed them to be a little more creative and wacky with their ideas. But come on, tracks like Pulk Pull Revolving Doors is just so fucking ridiculously out there and unorthodox in every possible way that it actually ends up being quite an interesting listen. Yeah, it's, again, just like Radiohead, very electronic heavy. A bit less so than, Kid A. It's just... But when the electronics do show up, it is some of the most, as I said, wackiest shit in Radiohead's discography. And it really does say a lot about how on top of the world the band felt that they were able to release some of these tracks without any, fear that maybe they wouldn't work out or people wouldn't listen. I think after Kid A, the band definitely just expanded their horizons experimentally, and this was just kind of furthering that, experimentation. They're scratching that creative itch and just doing something that, nobody could have seen coming. But one thing that does make it stand out from its predecessor, however, is its heavier reliance on jazz elements and very uncommon time signatures. In the case of Pyramid Song, it's got some absolute fantastic must-hear Radiohead tracks. Pyramid Song, of course, is the notable one, but I might be wrong. Life in a Glass House, I think this is worthy of being up there with in the league with Radiohead's better albums. I feel like this ranking is kind of separated into two parts: the bottom feeders and then the rest of their discography, and this is where the rest of their discography, the amazing part of this their discography starts for me. But yeah, it's just such an odd album. It's so unusual. It shouldn't work, but Radiohead were on top of the world, so they made it work.
I beg to differ with some moments, but it's whatever. Yeah, my favorite tracks from Amnesiac were Pyramid Song, Morning Bell / Amnesiac, the superior version of Morning Bell, by the way.
No.
Yes, and Life in a Glass House. My least favorite track is Hunting Bears. Fuck that song.
My favorite tracks are Pyramid Song, I Might Be Wrong, and Life in a Glass House. My least favorite track is Dollars and Cents.
Alright, we're moving on to number 6 picks, and I chose The Bends.
Another album that's moved down one because of another album moving up two. And my number 6 pick is A Moon-Shaped Pool.
Oh, wow. Okay, then.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah,
The Bends
that's
was...
movement.
That's a bit too much movement for my liking, but okay. Yeah. Yeah, The Bends was a really big stepping stone for Radiohead, as it saw the band kind of massively improve on everything that they did since Pablo Honey, and they were getting closer and closer to the Radiohead that we know, the Radiohead that made albums like OK Computer and Kid A. But even outside of what The Bends really is in the context of Radiohead's discography, I think it is still a fantastic alt-rock album that left a lot of room for Radiohead to improve, and it still has some fantastic and arguably some of the best moments in Radiohead's discography. On a lot of fronts, Radiohead improved their sound and only got better at writing more interesting songs. In contrast with Pablo Honey, The Bends feels far more layered and exciting. It's better written, it's better performed, it's catchier and more memorable. And that melancholic atmosphere that we see in almost every Radiohead album after this point has bled through into their sound from here. As an album, The Bends feels really cohesive and tight. No tracks really feel out of place at all, and within its tracklist is consistency, with tracks being very good at the very least and incredible at the very best. Tom York definitely steps up more as a singer-songwriter on this album, as his vocals feel much more controlled and captivating on The Bends. There are a lot of smartly written metaphorical songs on here, and he really stands out on this much more as a whole, in my opinion. Given that this is a 90s alt-rock album, there is bound to be some pastiche, which for sure turns up here, but I would be lying to you if I said I didn't say it's aged pretty well, especially the sound palette, as it's so vibrant and atmospheric. The band find a really good balance between the more atmospheric and heavy tracks, and out of those styles, there's just so many tracks to come from them each. There's only really one thing I can say negatively about The Bends, and it's not that negative to begin with, but Radiohead, in my opinion, have just made better records than The Bends, but that shouldn't really mean much considering that this is like Radiohead we're talking about, and Radiohead have made so many fantastic albums, The Bends being one of them, which makes it painful to put it this low, because every time I return to this thing, I fucking adore it. But it is what it is, and there's just a few Radiohead albums that I prefer. And yeah, I think The Bends is a fantastic alt-rock album. I think it's definitely one of the best alt-rock albums in the 90s. It stands out as being one of the best records out there for its time. And yeah, all in all, The Bends is great. I just think Radiohead have made better records, and there's just more records from them that I enjoyed thoroughly.
My number 6 pick, 6 was that right? 6,
yes.
Yeah. My number 6 pick was A Moon-Shaped Pool, which is in a way Radiohead's ambient album, not only due to the album's obvious ever-present ambient and ambient pop influences, but also due to the fact that the atmosphere is kind of the epicenter of this album, more so than anything else I think they've ever done. It embraces chamber pop, and it once again embraces electronic music to create a seamless juxtaposition between traditional and futuristic, as these subtle electronic and ambient elements are presented over a incredibly beautiful orchestral backdrop on a lot of these tracks. All of the orchestral sections on this project were composed by Johnny Greenwood and performed by the London Symphony Orchestra, and while implementing string sections was nothing new for the band, I think this is the only project where it's this prevalent, and it really adds a very unique flair to the album, and helps with the somber atmosphere and helps portray the somber nature of this album, because unfortunately, this is an album that is kind of surrounded by a mist of tragedy. Ever since the release of The King of Limbs, Radiohead went through the loss of their drum technician, Scott Johnson, to, the famous stage collapse in 2012. Producer Nigel Godrich lost his father the day that the strings on Burn the Witch were recorded. And, of course, Tom York divorced his late wife, Rachel Owen, in the midst of this album's production. So it's safe to say that pain kind of surrounded this album. Yeah, at the same time, it feels weirdly triumphant, beautiful, and ethereal in the face of pain. And it kind of just serves as a haunting tribute to love, death, and even nature. There really isn't much, if anything at all, that I can fault this album for. It's beautiful, it's brilliantly produced and performed, and it manages to again be a very unique entry in a discography that seems to have more variety than any band could ever dream of. Yet there's just a few albums in the band's catalog that are a little better, in my opinion. At this point, we're dealing with just like decimal points. But yeah, I think again this is an album that I absolutely love. It's an 8 out of 10 for me. And I think, just like Amnesiac, this project simply suffers because of how good Radiohead's discography is. Ultimately, maybe it's this album's more slow-burning and atmospheric nature that has made it one that I don't come back to as often. Not that I don't come back to it as often, I don't kind of find it as memorable and immediately, entrancing. But I still absolutely love it every time I do come back to it, and it's just, it again suffers because this band's just ridiculously consistent.
Fuck's sake, man. And with that in mind, my favorite tracks from The Bends are High and Dry, Fake Plastic Trees, and My Iron Lung. My least favorite track is Sulk.
My favorite tracks are Burn the Witch, Daydreaming, and True Love Waits, and I do not have any least favorite tracks for a number 6 pick, so there you go.
Alright then, and we've moved on to our number 5 picks. And with that in mind, kicking it off, I've chosen Hail to the Thief.
I've also chosen Hail to the Thief, an album that I initially ranked 7th.
Yeah.
And I had at a 7 out of 10, a light 7 out of 10 when we last did these rankings. Now I have it at a strong 8.
God damn.
It has grown on me.
Fucking hell, man. That is beyond based. And, Hail to the Thief. The political Radiohead album. Some people even go as far as to say it's the most overlooked Radiohead album. And, well, I agree to an extent. I think that Hail to the Thief is, on its own, just... It's fantastic. What can I say? It's an album that, for me, doesn't exactly deviate too much from what Radiohead tried to do on their more art rock and electronic-centered stuff, even though, it does take some new sonic ideas and risks. As well as that, it's an album that does overstay its welcome a bit too, but it's another one of those albums that I really love whenever I come back to it, despite its flaws. And even then, some of my favorite moments in Radiohead's discography are on here as well. And it's at number 5, and some of my favorite moments are on it. That just speaks to the fucking quality of what Radiohead do. And like I said, Hail to the Thief has a sonic palette that is very much like around that art rock and electronic combination that they were at for the past couple of albums. It even remains in that somber and abstract feel that some of Radiohead's best work has too. I mean, it's great majority of the time. Radiohead make great music. Who would have fucking guessed? I think they toy with a lot of interesting ideas across this album. There's more of an emphasis on odd time signatures and weird rhythmic passages on a few tracks. Some of them kind of carry over from Amnesiac as well. There's some chaotic production ideas and moments that are really explosive and somewhat heavy in terms of tone. And of course there's nice ballads here and there as well that are pretty great all in all. With all that in mind, Hail to the Thief sonically, it's very eclectic. It's arguably a bit all over the place with what it tries to achieve, and even with some moments that don't really do much majority of the time, this album is really great to me. A majority of this album is fantastic. I think just the sheer quality of the tracks on this thing really just blow me out of the water. There's so many 10 out of 10 tracks on this thing for me that it's insane. And I think that the way that it introduces a lot of its ideas and It's I guess it's more it's more weirdly driven sonics really makes it interesting thoroughly. Also, I think Tom York's more political approach to songwriting is really interesting. It kind of gives this record a quality that differentiates it from other Radiohead releases. I love a majority of the material on Hail to the Thief. Excuse me. I love a majority of the material on Hail to the Thief. I think some of the best tracks that the band have ever made are among this album's track list. Like 2 plus 2 equals 5 especially. Fucking hell, that song is incredible. But even then, Hail to the Thief, like I said, it's a bit flawed. I don't think that it's the most cohesive Radiohead album ever made. I think that some moments aren't interesting and come off as a bit of rushed filler, which the band kind of agrees with as well. But so much of this album hits for me. The genuine brilliance of a lot of these songs really carry this album and make it what it is, even despite its shortcomings, which is honestly why I put it over the bends, as painful as it was. I just fucking adore Hail to the Thief every time I go back and listen to it. So yeah, I love Hail to the Thief. I think this album is fantastic despite its flaws. I love so many of the tracks on here. And yeah, it's just up there for me, honestly. I really fuck with Hail to the Thief, and I always have.
Absolutely in love with this album, especially recently. Hail to the Thief is Radiohead's quote-unquote political album, mainly focusing on, obviously at the time, the war on terror and all the politics that came along with that. It was, for Radiohead, following Amnesiac, kind of a step back into, it's weird to say this, but sort of a more orthodox rock direction for the band, especially when compared to, Kid A and Amnesiac. The band kind of take a step back a little bit on the very electronic and heavily altered sounds of Kid A and Amnesiac. And while, there's still plenty of electronic aspects here, Radiohead were obviously far from done in experimenting in that department. The songs here are far more rock heavy. There's a lot more live instrumentation, and the electronics are kind of more so overdubbed and manipulated after the fact, and at times kept to sort of minimum. But while the album is, more conventional than their previous two albums in a lot of ways, I think it's far from being lacking in creativity and experimentation. The electronic aspects mixed with the more live and at times acoustic instrumentation are a very, very interesting blend. And the song structures here very often take a turn for the unexpected and make almost every track a really exciting experience, as they often build and expand into really interesting and at times just absolutely exhilarating directions. It's just a brilliant album with just so many fantastic compositions. I think it strikes a sweet spot between experimental and kind of accessible and fun and easy to listen. It does, to me, though, suffer in one department, and that is length. Not that I would be opposed to, 60 minutes of tracks as good as 2 plus 2 equals 5 or there. But it's just the less notable tracks like We Suck Young Blood or The Gloaming that kind of dampened my desire to return to this project for years. I still don't really care for those tracks all that much, particularly We Suck Young Blood, but they do make up a very, very tiny fraction of this album. And the better material on this project is just simply breathtaking, and there's just so much to love about Hail to the Thief. And it's gone up this whole last point for me. It's now an 8.
Fucking based, my friend. And with that in mind, my favourite tracks from Hail to the Thief are 2 plus 2 equals 5, There, and Mixomatosis. My least favourite track is We Suck Young Blood.
My favourite tracks are 2 plus 2 equals 5, Sit Down, Stand Up, and There. And my least favourite track is We Suck Young Blood.
I 100% agree with your takes on We Suck Young Blood and The Gloaming, man. And at our number 4 picks, and I chose A Moon-Shaped Pool.
I chose The Bends.
Da Bends. Okay, as of right now, the most recent Radiohead album is in fact A Moon-Shaped Pool, which came out in 2016. And since I first started getting into Radiohead, it was one of my favorite albums that the band had ever made. Obviously, putting it fourth doesn't mean much because it's fucking Radiohead, but A Moon-Shaped Pool really does stand out to me in their discography. And, since I first heard it, I fucking adore this album. A Moon-Shaped Pool sonically is very much a different approach than what Radiohead did beforehand. A lot of Watts on A Moon-Shaped Pool is just simply breathtaking, and the band successfully managed to reinvent themselves once again with a sonic palette that is inspired by organic and chamber instrumentation, while at the same time kind of keeping with subtle electronics and ambience, like you mentioned. It feels like the most organic Radiohead album to me, even with that in mind, and its eclectic variety of instrumentation really does keep it fresh and interesting, while at the same time it does feel very cohesive in my opinion. It's probably one of the most cohesive Radiohead albums. Radiohead, not the cheeriest band around, I'm sure everybody knows, but A Moon-Shaped Pool is probably their most melancholic and their most somber. And that was for a lot of reasons. Like, a lot of the background stuff that you mentioned were huge contributors as to what A Moon-Shaped Pool came out as. And the atmosphere that A Moon-Shaped Pool has really exemplifies that, alongside Tom York's songwriting especially, which is often just so heart-wrenching. Instrumentally, I fucking love A Moon-Shaped Pool. It sounds absolutely stellar. Radiohead tie-in a lot of string arrangements across this album which just sound immaculate. The pianos, the drums, the ambience, the guitars, they all blend so well together and sound fantastic. They're complemented well by brilliant production, and often it just sounds absolutely beautiful. And every time I come back to this album, I just get engrossed in what the band has to offer here, and I just adore nearly every single track on this album. The atmosphere, the eclecticism, the sonic palette, and the ideas are just stellar across this album. I can't even really say there's a song of this thing that's bad or even underwhelming. Even some of the quote-unquote weaker moments on A Moon-Shaped Pool are great at the very least, and throughout, a lot of my personal favourite Radiohead songs appear on this too. I won't kid anyone if this was... I won't even kid anyone, sorry. If this was genuinely the last album that we were ever going to get from Radiohead, I honestly wouldn't complain, because I think A Moon-Shaped Pool is the perfect swan song for the band. It's just that incredible of an album to me, and even after, creating so many masterpieces beforehand, A Moon-Shaped Pool adds to that, and it's just another marvelous experience of an album. So yeah, all in all, I adore A Moon-Shaped Pool. I genuinely think it's one of the most beautiful albums to have come out in the last decade. It's up there amongst Radiohead's masterpieces, in my opinion. And I love and adore this thing for what it is, and it's genuinely just a fantastic album.
Do you think it'll be their last project?
I don't know, but if it is, I wouldn't complain.
Something tells
me
it
look, it would be sad.
Yeah,
it would be sad if it would be their last album. But at the same time, I'm perfectly fine with A Moon-Shaped Pool being their last album.
Fair enough. I think they've still got another album or two in them.
Yeah, maybe two. I think maybe one more.
Yeah, we'll see.
We'll see.
Anyways, my number 4 pick is The Bends. Da Bends, bro.
Da Bends.
The contrast in public perception between The Bends and the band's debut, Pablo Honey, may lead you to believe that the band had completely reinvented their sound here, but in reality, I think this is more the result of the band maturing in their songwriting and dropping a lot of the grungy angst of their debut. The album still largely fits in among contemporaries in 90s alt-rock and Britpop, but this is also certainly the first project that the band released where you may come out of it thinking, hold on, there is a lot more to this band than I initially thought. There is an ambition about, Radiohead that is already present on the Bends, an ambition that makes something larger than themselves, makes something magical, and that magic certainly does show its head throughout this project. Fake Plastic Trees is one of the band's absolute finest moments. It's a gut-wrenching ballad which longs for an escape from consumerism. My Iron Lung is a whiplash-inducing banger which critiques the popularity of creep. And then there's Street Spirit, Fade Out, an existential crisis with a comforting resolution and just one of the greatest closing tracks of all time. It may be unassuming at first glance. It may not be entirely dissimilar from Pablo Honey, in that it is, at its core alt rock, but it really was a leap towards greatness from the band after their divisive debut. And it's honestly some of the best 90s alt rock had to offer. It's it's a few notches below the band's top 3 albums, which we'll get to soon, but it's still just a brilliant album. It does so much right. It has so many absolute standout tracks, and even despite the band's just relentlessness in just improving and progressing their sound and expanding it to new horizons, there are still a few tracks on this project that just absolutely stand the test of time, and to this day stand with some of the band's finest moments.
Alright, and with that in mind, my favourite tracks from A Moon-Shaped Pool are Burn the Witch, Daydreaming, and True Love Waits. If I had to pick a least favourite track, it would probably be Tinker, Tailor, Soldier, Sailor, Rich Man, Poor Man, Beggar Man, Thief.
Can you repeat that?
Yes. Tinker, Tailor, Soldier, Sailor, Rich Man, Poor Man, Beggar Man, Thief.
Alright, now backwards.
No.
Okay. My favourite tracks on the Bends, or on Da Bends, are Fake Plastic Trees, Ma Iron Lung, and Street Spirit Fade Out. I do not have any of these favourite tracks.
Da Bends.
Da Bends.
And we've made it to the top 3.
Ooh.
And all the same fucking albums too. Who would have guessed?
Yeah.
And with that in mind, my number 3 pick is Kid A.
My number 3 pick, and my first 10 out of 10, is In Rainbows.
God damn. So, here we have it. Kid A. The greatest left turn in music history, so people say. The moment where Radiohead changed their sound and made an electronic album, since it's become one of the band's most beloved albums, and it's easy to see why, since Kid A is genuinely a fantastic album. A bit flawed in my opinion, but fantastic nonetheless. And I say flawed in massive quotation marks. Everybody knows the story behind Kid A and how burnt out the band were after how successful OK Computer was. All that and their disdain for their never-ending tour cycle, and the industry basically culminated into them wanting to ditch their rock sound and move on to sounds inspired by electronic and ambient. A lot of which was inspired by artists on Warp Records like Aphex Twin. In turn, we see an album of icy synths, manipulated vocals, samples, and so on. And with all that, it culminates into one of Radiohead's finest albums. I suppose I'll just start with my main gripe with Kid A first. While there isn't a bad song on this album at all, in fact the material on this album is pretty great, it does feel kind of disjointed with what it tries to present, and with that it makes the middle part of the album feel a bit too slow for my liking. Like when it gets to Tree Fingers, it just becomes a tad bit sluggish for a few tracks. Like I said, there isn't a bad track out of those ones either. I actually like Tree Fingers anyway. But I just feel like they could have been better in terms of pacing. But even then, there are too many great tracks on this album, and it picks up so much pace thereafter. Yeah, Kid A, to put it bluntly, is just fantastic. It's easily one of Radiohead's best albums for a reason. It's this cold, dystopian electronica that's just something else. And with what Radiohead incorporated, it sounds stellar. The band didn't completely ditch the rock instrumentation, but the electronic aspects became basically heavily prevalent and were the main focus, and they applied those elements in an incredibly tasteful way. In turn, the best material on this album is just otherworldly, like everything in its right place, How to Disappear Completely, motion picture soundtrack. Like fucking hell, these tracks are just out of this fucking world. They are on Mars. Plus, it's not like the route they took incorporated your typical electronic elements. Like, they decided to go a bit abstract and a bit more leaning towards a lot of the ambience and a lot of the somewhat IDM-inspired stuff, like on Idiotech. They decided to turn, some of the more abstract leanings on this thing into something that's just so insanely otherworldly and beautiful. And we get a lot of these weird yet intriguing ideas and nuances. Like, every single time I come back to this album, there's always something subtle that I pick up on, and just some interesting nuances that come up that I didn't even notice before. Like, it's that layered, it's that packed full of interesting ideas, and even then, the songs themselves are just fucking amazing. The soundscape and the atmosphere of Kid A is incredible. The synth tones are amazing. The incorporations of organic instrumentation with the electronics are done so well. Tom York sounds so good whenever his vocals aren't being manipulated, and all in all, there are just so many amazing tracks to be found in this thing. Some moments that are arguably among Radiohead's best. So yeah, this album is absolutely amazing. It fucking pains me to put it in third, but look, there's a couple of other records that I prefer, but still, Kid A is amazing. It's a groundbreaking album for Radiohead, and it's got so much to offer in Radiohead's discography.
My number 3 pick was absolute masterpiece in Rainbows. So much of Radiohead's music since OK Computer was drenched in an otherworldly beauty and a sort of synthetic mystique. And while, beauty and mystique are two things that are certainly present on In Rainbows, there's something just more human about this album. There's absolutely nothing otherworldly about it. It's perhaps the most human album the band have released in well over a decade. At the point it was released, it's an album which embraces the traditional instrumentally by tuning down the electronic aspects of the music to an absolute minimum. Yet at the same time, what it does with this, quote unquote simplistic approach is nothing short of extraordinary. The instrumentals here all just carry such class, such lushness. It's an absolute masterpiece compositionally. Everything was just put together so beautifully. Every single sound, texture, just so perfect in the grand scheme of this album. Tom York's voice shines like never before, time and time again. Reckoner, Nude, just so many breathtaking vocal performances appear throughout this album. It's just the epitome of beauty. On prior and indeed following Radiohead albums, beauty was oftentimes accompanied by just a coldness, a pain. But a lot of the beauty on In Rainbows, it just is warm. It's life-affirming. It makes me feel good, which I don't tend to listen to Radiohead to feel good. Thankfully, videotape exists, so I don't have to feel good for too long. The older I get, the more I appreciate just how perfect this album is. There's more to life than wallowing in despair, and sometimes you just need to listen to an album that makes you look around and think, you know what, shit's fucking good. World's beautiful. It's crumbling, but whatever. I love In Rainbows.
Yeah. And with that in mind, my favourite tracks from Kid A are Everything in Its Right Place, How to Disappear Completely, and Idiotech. If I had to pick a least favourite, it would be Tree Fingers.
My favorite tracks on In Rainbows, this is the first instance we're doing this, is so fucking hard, are Nude, Weird Fishes, and Reckoner. I do not have any least favorites.
And we're on to the final 2 albums. And in my opinion, Radiohead's second best album is In Rainbows.
In my opinion, Radiohead's second best album is OK Computer.
Some things never change. Okay.
Yeah. Identical top 3s, right?
Yeah, pretty much. In Rainbows. I fucking love In Rainbows. It's probably the single most refreshing album in Radiohead's discography, and it houses one of the band's most consistent track lists and some of their best songs. In fact, it has my favourite Radiohead song on it as well. It's probably the Radiohead album that I actually return to the most, actually, but even though I have another album above it, In Rainbows is just something else. It's just one of those albums that's just so playful and warm that you just can't help but return to a lot of its most beautiful and just most fun moments. And it's another masterpiece from Radiohead. It's easily one of the best albums for sure. And I've been kidding myself for fucking years at this stage, so I finally decided to bump it up to a 10. This album is a fucking masterpiece. I adore it to bits. In contrast with the other albums in Radiohead's discography, In Rainbows is easily the most kind of warm, life-affirming, and playful album that the band have ever made. It doesn't have the same atmosphere that previous Radiohead albums had before. It's not the cold Radiohead that we see on fucking Kid A and OK Computer. But it's just the warmness and the playfulness of what Radiohead were trying to do on this thing that makes it just so unique, and it's just amazing. There's so many amazing songs on in Rainbows that are just equal parts fun and just pure beauty. Like Radiohead, like you said, Radiohead albums and Radiohead songs generally are just like they exemplify beauty in the coldness and the just in the melancholy that they display. But in Rainbows is beautiful for the fact that it is just such a kind of warm and mellow album, while at the same time it's just so grounded and natural. It feels like the most grounded Radiohead I've ever sounded. You know, instrumentally, a lot of the jams on here are just really playful, just extremely colorful. They have personality. They're performed well. They just sound immaculate as all hell. Especially the guitar work on this album, which is just fucking amazing. It has this very playful, watery quality to it that I adore, and the other instrumental performances complement it so well too. You know, where other Radiohead albums feel kind of anxious, in Rainbows feels at peace. It feels relaxed and carefree. You can hear that in the instrumentation. It has its beautiful melancholic moments that are just transcendental, like the aforementioned videotape, which is just Jesus Christ. But that balance with its more kind of gorgeous yet playful moments are like Weird Fishes, for example, gives it just such a unique mood and unique feel for Radiohead, and I just adore it every single time I go back to it. Tom York sounds incredible on this album. Some of his best vocals ever are on this thing. I mentioned the guitar work on this album already, which is some of the best Radiohead I've ever done. I think Phil Selway's drumming doesn't get enough credit, but on this album he truly shines and provides some fantastic performances on drums, and just instrumentally, this whole thing is just fucking perfect in my opinion. Nothing feels out of place. It all just feels so natural and free-flowing and warm and playful. I say warm and playful a lot, but this is literally what In Rainbows is. And yeah, all in all, I won't waste any more time because I'll be blabbering on for fucking 2 hours. I think this album is just chock full of Radiohead's most important and some of their best songs ever. I think that the way that it adds to Radiohead's discography is just incredibly unique, incredibly interesting, and just the mood that it has, the instrumentation that it has, the way that it sounds all together just makes it one of the most replayable and most valuable moments in Radiohead's discography. I love so much about this album. I love the instrumentation. I love the performances. I love Tom York's vocals. My favorite Radiohead song is on this album, which I will mention in Best Tracks. And honestly, I'm so glad I bumped this up to a 10. This thing is just fucking flawless. I love In Rainbows so much.
I also bumped In Rainbows up to a 10.
Fucking beast, man!
Preparing for this. But now we move on to an album that's always been a 10 for me, and is in fact, despite only being second on this ranking, probably like my 5th favorite album of all time. I'm talking about OK Computer. In a lot of ways, the Radiohead album. If you're familiar with this channel, that means you have at least a passing interest in music. And if you have even a passing interest in music, then you're almost certainly well acquainted with OK Computer, perhaps the most critically acclaimed album of all time, and certainly the most acclaimed album of the 90s in my eyes. And yes, despite that being quite the introduction, it's only second on my favorite Radiohead albums of all time list. But this album is just perfect in every way. It's the textbook definition of a classic album. It's the textbook definition of a perfect album, and it's also just a textbook definition of career defining. And I guess if you could call one Radiohead album career defining, it would be this one, although it's hard to really define Radiohead.
I mean, like, they keep reinventing themselves. It's so hard to fucking define.
But this is the Radiohead album to so many people that I think if anyone had to listen to one, even myself, who wouldn't consider this to be their best, would probably point them towards this. The minimal and raw alternative rock sound of the band's first two albums is at times indistinguishable from what the band would become and present on OK Computer. And while songwriting on this record is absolutely second to none, the most poetic thing about this album still just remains the sheer scope of every single composition and just the ever so perfect production. From the moment the album opens up with Airbag, it's evident you're in for something special, and that feeling of excitement and awe just has not faded for me at all, even after years of just listening to this album so often. I just still go into this album filled with the astonishment and admiration I had for it that filled me when I first heard it. At its core, if this album was, entirely stripped back to the same level of instrumental complexity as their first two albums, it would have still been just an incredible album, with just incredible songwriting, as I said, enchanting vocal performances from Tom York, and just fantastic and tight instrumentation, and an ever-present theme that is as powerful today as it was back in 1997. But the production and the really unsettling yet comforting atmospheres all brings this album up to the upper echelon of music history for me. This album is just drenched in an unsettling anxiousness and cold melancholy. It's a melancholy which is made possible by the dense and futuristic production, and a melancholy from which the album's unorthodox yet really introspective beauty is allowed to emerge. Every single track on this album is perfect. Every second of this album is as memorable as music gets, and listening to this thing from start to finish is just an experience which will never get old, and it'll just continue to stand the test of time for years to come. While it's, as I said, not my personal favorite album of all time, not even my favorite Radiohead album, it just still looks completely at home, in my opinion, on top of just the countless top albums of all time lists this sits upon, including the Rate Your Music one. It feels like an entity that is bigger than just an album. It's a perfect representation of the zeitgeist of the early internet era, and all that comes with it, both the beautiful, the ugly, everything in between. It's okay, Computer. I don't need to say too much more. It's okay, Computer. You've heard this album.
It is in fact okay, Computer. Everyone has heard this album. Like, come on, you're kidding yourself. Yeah. Anyways, my favorite tracks from In Rainbows are Nude, Weird Fishes Arpeggi, which is my favorite Radiohead song, and Jigsaw Falling Into Place. I have no least favorite tracks. Everything on this is perfect.
Again, this was fucking insanely hard. My favorite tracks on Radiohead OK Computer are Airbag, Paranoid Android, and Let Down. And obviously no least favorite tracks. Even Fittier. Fucking rules.
Fitter. Happier.
Here.
More productive.
I was watching, this is so off topic, I can't remember whose stream, but someone on Twitch did a text-to-speech donation of the
Was it XQC?
Oh no, it was CDogVA. Did a full-on...
I don't know what the fuck that is, but okay.
He's a Japanese...
I remember seeing that, actually.
He's a weeb streamer. He was cycling across Japan, and someone fucking text-to-speach donated the entirety of Fitter Happier to him.
I remember seeing that clip, actually.
Yeah, he was just like, what? The fuck was that? Okay.
Oh my god. No, that is the funniest fuck clip. Yeah, enough bullshitting. Alright, number 1. OK Computer. Who would have fucking guessed?
Well, number 1, it's me. It's Kid A. Everyone who knows me is not surprised.
Some things never change.
Yep, not at all. Not even in the slightest.
And if you've noticed, my list has not fucking changed once over the years. Not even kidding.
Mine has, only in the form of what's it called? Hail to the Thief, going up 2 places.
I don't like change, okay?
All right. Sorry.
No, I'm only joking. I'm only joking.
Redo the episode.
Okay, we'll start from the beginning. Okay. Okay, so our number 9 picks, I chose the King of Lips. Okay.
Oh, yeah, of course.
Alright, so, yeah. OK Computer. What can I really say about it that tons of people haven't said already? I mean, it's OK Computer. Arguably one of the greatest albums ever made. Arguably the best Radiohead album. In my opinion, it is both of those things. But OK Computer is also just a super important album for me as well. You know, I won't read out a thesis on it, but to make it long story short, I probably wouldn't be listening to as much music as I do, or listen to the variety of music that I do, without OK Computer. It was a gateway album for me when I first heard it. And to this day, I still love and absolutely adore this album. Unlike a lot of people's gateway albums, OK Computer is just as incredible as it was when I first heard it, and to this day, it's still one of my favorite albums of all time. OK Computer is one of those albums that just never lost its flair every single time I went back to it and listened to it. I come away from it just as blown away as I was when I first heard it, and that's mostly down to just how incredible and breathtaking the material on this album is. Also, as a cohesive album sonically, structurally, and conceptually, OK Computer is just so well crafted and masterful. With more listens, you can peel back so many layers and interesting nuances, plus you come away with plenty of incredible songs. To this day, some of the most perfect musical moments I've ever heard are on OK Computer, hands down. OK Computer has been tough enough to dissect for me, since there's never really one of those unique ways that you can do it, because anything and everything has already been said about OK Computer. Even trying to give it a category outside of alt rock or even art rock is difficult enough for me, because for its time there isn't really much out there that took the conventions that OK Computer was taking from and just did something entirely new and alien with it. It's like one of those albums that transcends like genre or category that you can give it, and it's hard for me to kind of box it in, but either way, like, the music itself is just perfect. It's a masterpiece. As for the music itself, it is gorgeous. Instrumentally, the album is dynamic and varied. It features just so much eclectic instrumentation and healthy balances in what the band want to toy with tonally. And with that, they make music that is poignant, unique, hard-hitting, and even beautiful. It exemplifies the late 90s and the early 2000s internet, and honestly, the themes ring true. A lot of the themes and the lyrical tropes kind of ring true to this day, in my opinion. It takes from a lot of styles, but it puts it through a space where it can feel something entirely new, but while staying cohesive with a melancholic and dystopian feel. That feel is even further reflected by the concept of the lyrics, which I mentioned. They feel poetic and even grim at points, but they're written with poignancy and a passion that makes them stand out much more. And plus, the varying guitar tones and different just guitar passages on this thing are just great as well. I fucking adore what they do guitar work wise. Tom York's vocals are at their best on OK Computer. He sounds just amazing across this album, fits so well alongside the anxious instrumentation. I like how he adds that anxiousness to the project while at the same time making these songs feel even more grand and existential than they already are. Finally, the songs on OK Computer are fucking incredible. Like I said earlier, some of the best musical moments ever are on this album in my opinion. Some of which are just peak music and are some of my favorite songs of all time, and even deeper cuts that I don't really return to as much as the others still blow me away whenever I hear them. They never lose their power, and that's what I love most about this album, really. It never loses that power that it has when you first listen to it. And I mean, there's a reason why this album is considered one of the greatest albums of all time. It's a reason why it's number one, like, on the ROAM charts right now, or reason why it's so critically acclaimed and as beloved since it came out. It's just that fantastic, that defining for Radiohead, and just that much of an incredible album. So yeah, I adore OK Computer. I know it's cliched as fuck to say, but I don't care. I think OK Computer is one of the greatest albums ever made. It's one of my favorite albums of all time, and what Radiohead did on this album is truly remarkable. The songs are amazing, the themes are amazing, it still feels really unique, and it is aged amazingly. It is genuinely a masterpiece.
Absolute facts. However, my number one pick is Kid A. It's been... Sorry, I'll just readjust my chair.
Okay,
get in proper Kid A discussing position.
Okay, you're ready to read out the thesis?
It may have been close to 3 years since we originally did a Radiohead worst to best, but my top pick has not budged in the entire time I've been a Radiohead fan, let alone those 3 years. Kid A has always and will always be my favorite Radiohead album. It's also my third favorite album of all time. I already mentioned during the Amnesiac segment that Radiohead shifted their sound at the turn of the millennium to something far more electronic and a little less rock oriented. But as much as I love even Amnesiac, it really lives in the shadow of its older brother in practically every department. I'll start with the obvious and reiterate just how Radiohead shifted their sound to something completely removed from their rock roots. Most of the tracks on here completely throw the bass, guitar, drum, instrumental structure that was ever present in the band's music, no matter how much they matured their sound. It threw that completely out the window. There's synthesized drums, just bizarre and off-kilter electronic drum patterns. There's just eclectic genre influences around every corner. The opening track, Everything in Its Right Place, immediately makes a statement. Radiohead have completely opened up a new can of worms here, and you fucking bet they absolutely excel at it. It's genuinely one of the most varied albums I've ever heard. It's got an ambient drone track in Three Fingers. It's got an acoustic ballad in How to Disappear Completely, an alt-rock banger in Optimistic, a fucking IDM track in Idiotech. There's orchestral moments at the back end of a motion picture soundtrack, an instrumental jazz rock masterpiece in the national anthem, and all of this and more on one album, yet somehow it never sounds disjointed. It never sounds jarring and transitioning between these widely different styles. It just flows seamlessly, perfectly. Everything in its right place. Everything falls under the same bone-chilling melancholy atmosphere. And the reason those aforementioned ever-present electronic elements all sound so uneasy, so uncanny, so haunting, it's because of that just lack of structure. There's just something off about this album, something you wouldn't expect from a rock album anyway. And it gives it this just ever-present, uneasy, uncanny aesthetic and feeling. Aside from the variety and, the well-executed electronic direction, I really think the standout yet sometimes understated thing about Kid A that greatly contributes to why I adore this project so much is the production and the sheer depth of the arrangements and mixing on this album. In my opinion, personally, Kid A is the best produced album of all time. It is crafted with such an astounding amount of care, attention to detail, and arrangement choices that I can only describe it as just genius. To this day, just as you said, I get blown away by the fact that there are little tiny details scattered throughout this project that I've not noticed ever before.
Yeah.
And I've listened to this thing so many times. There's every single one of these details that, occasionally I'll come across a new one, or, well, not come across, I'll notice a new one. All of these little details add up perfectly to create an album that to me feels like it's too good to have been made by humans. This thing is a masterpiece. I adore it more than words can describe, and I can talk about it for far longer than most people would care to hear me talk about it for. But this is the Radiohead album for me. It's something else entirely. I fucking love it. Love it.
I fucking love it, lads. And with that in mind, my favorite tracks on OK Computer are Paranoid Android, Exit Music for a Film, and No Surprises. And no surprise there, I have no least favorite tracks.
My favorite tracks are How to Disappear Completely, Idiotech, and my favorite Radiohead track of all time, Motion Picture Soundtrack. No least favorites.
And with that, Radiohead Redux Worst to Best concludes.
100 episodes concludes.
Holy shit, dude.
Let's fucking go.
Man, I can't believe it. 100 episodes. Fuck's sake.
God, we're so hard working.
We're still going strong after all this time. Fucking hell. And, I suppose I'll just, first and foremost, I just want to say a thank you to, every single person who has ever bothered to even watch our podcasts for the past couple of years. Or even, come on, all our previous guests, everyone who's been with us on the channel for a while, everyone we've interviewed, everyone we've done Worst Best with, everyone who constantly talks in the Discord and basically just comes onto our worst to best as well, comes onto our streams. Like, we wouldn't be where we are right now without any of you guys. And it's it's insane to think that we're still doing it 3 years later, almost 3 years later, might add. And yeah, I suppose just thank you all so much for supporting us however you can, whether it be through just being part of our community, watching our podcasts, and even our patrons as well, Joshua, Aubrey, and Coner. And just thank you guys so much. Honestly, it's mad. Do you have anything to add?
It's still just as fun.
Yeah, it's still so much fun. It's so much fun, and we're gonna keep fucking going for as long as we can, and we can't wait to bring you so much more. And do you have anything else to add, Miho?
Nah, fucking cassette tape forever, baby.
TCT
200. Let's go.
200. We're gonna get there in another 3 years. Let's go.
Let's go.
Okay, so yeah, once again, thank you guys so much for checking out today's Radiohead Worst to Best Redux. We really hope that you enjoyed, and we know that you will all agree that this is the far superior version of the Radiohead Worst to Best. And yeah, of course, necessary links will be in the description to Patreon, Discord, all that jazz. And yeah, my name's MickyT.
I've been Nostalgia.
See you next time.
Peace and love.
Fitter. Happier. More productive.
More productive.
Productive to 200, baby.
Woo!